Medical Affairs from Shield Healthcare, and we all live in this microbial uncertain times. So we bring a lot of educational initiatives for very important topics. Big thanks to all the doctors for logging in, and it's my privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Sweta ma'am. Actually, ma'am needs no introduction, but I will still introduce ma'am. Ma'am is currently a director of fertility at Southern Gem Hospital. Ma'am has done her MBBS, MS, and ma'am has done her masters in reproductive endocrinology and infertility from Australia. Contributions from ma'am is immense in the fertility sphere. She has been an author and done many studies. She was author of the IFS bulletins of childhood cancers and fertility preservation, hypogonadotrophic hypogonadotrophism. Ma'am also authored bleeding in HRT chapter in Ballieri's best practice and research. Ma'am was a course director for AMS fertility fellowship program at the prestigious Southern Gem Hospital. Ma'am has been a faculty in numerous national and international conferences. Recently also ma'am presented a paper, the just concluded research, and that paper won the best paper award. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Kiran, for your kind words. So I welcome all the doctors who have logged in today for this program. And I hope that in this tough times with the COVID pandemic, all our and their families are safe and healthy. And this webinar, it's an opportunity for us to stay connected and be hopeful. There is light at the end of the tunnel. It's like that. So I'm thankful to Shield, Kiran, and the entire team at Shield to give me an opportunity to get connected with all of you all. So we'll go for start the talk. So basically the talk is divided into two parts. One is we will talk initially about the pelvic inflammatory disease, and then we will talk about the role of the probiotics in infertility. So what is pelvic inflammatory disease? It's an acute and subclinical infection of the upper genital tract structures in women, and it's involving any or all of the structures like the uterus, the oviducts, the ovaries, and this can be often accompanied by the involvement of the neighboring pelvic organs. So it's very important to note that it can be an acute infection or subclinical infection. So quite often the patient may present to us with acute infection, and sometimes when they present to us, they would be having just infertility symptoms, and we would have missed the subclinical infections, and the patient would have missed the opportunity to get treated with that. So why we need to discuss about pelvic inflammatory disease is in infertility, it's got a big impact on the tubal factor infertility. So when we talk about infertility, tubal factor infertility, it accounts for 30% of the cases with female infertility. And of this, 15% of the women with PID and again, it depends upon the number of episodes of PID a woman has experienced. It is directly proportional. So the more the number of episodes of PID a woman would have had, the more is the chances and more severe is the damage to the tubes. So just talking about the vaginal flora first. So the vaginal flora is mostly normal, and in healthy women, it has a variety of potentially pathogenic bacteria, but the most dominant ones are the non-pathogenic hydrogen peroxide producing the lactobacillus species, and then other organisms are low in number. So under the influence of the various hormonal changes which takes place in the body, like around pregnancy, during the menstrual cycle, depending upon the contraceptive method the women uses, the sexual activity, and yet some other unknown factors, this balance can sometimes get altered. So that's when the patient is more likely to get this pelvic infections. So PID principally is a mixed polymicrobial infection, and in majority of the cases, in 85% of the cases, it is sexually transmitted pathogens, which is particularly the Neisseria gonorrhoeae and Chlamydia trachomatis, which are the main pathogens which are identified in PID. So chlamydia trachomatis is about seen in 1/3 of the cases of pelvic inflammatory disease. And the main problem with chlamydia infections is they are quite often subclinical infection, and patient may not present with symptoms, and it causes marked damage to the fallopian tubes. So about 15% of the women who have an endocervical gonococcal infection, they go on to develop the pelvic inflammatory disease. And gonococcal PID is severe. So patients with gonococcal infection, they have acute infections and they present to our clinic with the symptoms of PID. And so most often with gonococcal infections, we lead to earlier diagnosis as well as treatment. So nowadays, Mycobacterium genitalium is also a sexually transmitted infection, and it's more emerging in women. So there is a growing evidence supporting an association of cervicitis and PID in women. So what are the major risk factors which we need to take into consideration is, one is the multiple sexual partners. So because of the changing trend in our society and with urbanization and more women who are working, delayed marriages and all, there is increasing incidence of having multiple sexual partners. So that is why the incidence of PID is increasing. So the more the number of sexual partners, there is a 5 to 20-fold increase in the PID infection. Second most important thing is the contraceptive method which is used. Barrier contraception is protective. So it is very important that when we talk to the patients about the sexual hygiene, we have to encourage that they should be using barrier contraception. Young women, so younger women have high frequency of this infection. So particularly between 15 to 25 years of age group, it is more common. And if the women age is more than 35, only 1/7 of them get this PID. Sometimes the women may have been in a monogamous relationship with the husband, but the husband may have multiple partners. That also exposes these women to pelvic infections. So if the partner has sexually transmitted infection, the risk of the wife having the PID is also high. So when we talk about treatment of this PID, it's important that the husband also is treated at the same time, so that it reduces her risk of reinfection. Women with a previous PID, so about 1 in 4 women with PID in the past, they have a risk of recurrence. So in one study, they showed that previous episode of PID increased the risk of having subsequent episode of PID by a factor of 2.3. And coming to the most important thing is the bacterial vaginosis. So what happens in bacterial vaginosis is there's a complete vaginal ecosystem in which the anaerobic bacteria, they gain predominance over the desirable strain of lactobacilli. And whenever there is bacterial vaginosis, the woman, when she's exposed to any sexually transmitted infections like Neisseria gonorrhoeae or chlamydia or any other sexually transmitted infection, they tend to ascend up into the upper genital tract. So the lactobacilli which is there and the acidic pH of the vagina. So normal vaginal pH is 3.6 to 4.5 and it's slightly on the acidic side. That is protecting the sexually transmitted infection from ascending up. So when this vaginal flora is disturbed, in that situation, it favors the ascending of the infection. Even the endocervix is protective for the infections and that also gets disturbed. So these are few studies which are favoring in terms of saying that how can bacterial vaginosis may be a factor in causing this the sexually transmitted infection to ascend up. So rather than a single organism impairing female infertility, variation of the overall vaginal microbiome such as bacterial vaginosis may also have a role in infertility. So this is a study from Sirota and his group in 2014. Then there was another study from 2015 which looked at Nigerian women. So they saw that bacterial vaginosis was 4 times more prevalent in women with tubal factor infertility compared to the fertile control women. So the more the bacterial vaginosis supports the infection and it makes it more virulent. Then there's a more recent study from 2015 which looks at the meta-analysis and systematic review of 12 studies which looks at the role of bacterial vaginosis and infertility, which has shown that bacterial vaginosis is significantly more prevalent in infertile women than in the pregnant women of the same population. So this review estimated that 1 in 5 infertile women had bacterial vaginosis and at least 1 in 3 had abnormal vaginal microflora. So bacterial vaginosis is significantly more prevalent in tubal factor infertility patients than in patients who have non-tubal factor infertility. And then a few other papers where we talk about vaginal microbiome and sexually transmitted infection. So again, bacterial vaginosis is a common clinical syndrome in which protective lactic acid producing bacteria, which is particularly the lactobacillus, they are replaced by a diverse range of anaerobic bacteria. So again, epidemiological studies have demonstrated that bacterial vaginosis is associated with a markedly increased risk of acquiring sexually transmitted infection, and transmission of STI is also associated with bacterial vaginosis. Since bacterial vaginosis, it increases the replication of the virus and vaginal shedding. So it is an independent risk factor for reproductive tract and even obstetric sequelae. It increases the risk of preterm delivery. So I would not go more into obstetric, but yes, there is in patients with bacterial vaginosis, there is increased incidence of premature delivery and development of PID, STI, and even there is acquisition and transmission of HIV is also more in these patients. So a number of studies again have looked up the culture and demonstrated that vaginal microbiota predisposes to PID and STI. And in another GIFT study which looked at women in US, about 1100 women, where clusters of bacterial vaginosis associated microbiota were identified by culture method and they were known to be associated with pelvic infection. So definitely bacterial vaginosis has a role to play in pelvic inflammatory disease and in infertility. So what is the pathway of infection? So what happens is when the woman is exposed to this the gonococcal or chlamydia or any other STIs, there is initially cervicitis and then it ascends up, it causing endometritis, then salpingitis, oophorytis. Patient may develop tubo-ovarian abscess. It can spread through the tubes to the peritoneum causing pelvic peritonitis and pelvic abscess. So depending on how early it is diagnosed, how early it is treated, we can control the infection. So the patient can present with wide range of clinical presentation. So early diagnosis and treatment, they are the key elements to prevent the long-term sequelae such as infertility and ectopic pregnancy. So any young women who is sexually active presenting with the symptoms of pelvic discomfort, you should have a very low threshold to suspect pelvic PID. So index should be very high, particularly in adolescent and young adults. You should take this as an opportunity to treat these women so that they do not develop the sequelae of this infection, which will later lead to infertility and damage to the tubes, leading to ectopic pregnancies and other problems. So apart from pelvic discomfort, other common symptom which the patient presents with purulent endocervical discharge and vaginal discharge. And when you examine this patient, there will be cervical motion tenderness, uterine tenderness, adnexal tenderness, which are the characteristic symptoms of acute PID. And when you have these symptoms, what test which could do is, one is always in young women, always do a pregnancy test to rule out pregnancy. You can take the vaginal wet stain preparations can be done of the vaginal discharge to look at the microscopy. And when you want to confirm the diagnosis of either chlamydia trachomatis or Neisseria gonorrhoeae, you have to do the NAD test. The nucleic acid amplification test is recommended by the CDC. And it's always wise to check for common sexually transmitted infections, such as look at HIV, and the VDRL test for syphilis has to be done. And not all patients with PID need an ultrasound. So based on the history of pelvic discomfort, vaginal discharge and all, we can give the start the treatment for this patient. Ultrasound can be done if the patient is not responding to this particular treatment. In those cases, or if the patient is very sick, we can do an ultrasound. So what you can see on ultrasound is thickened and fluid-filled fallopian tubes. So the fallopian tubes can be thickened, there can be fluid in the fallopian tubes, and one of the most problematic thing is the pyosalpinx or the hydrosalpinx. So sometimes women who have endometritis, the ultrasound can show fluid in the endometrial cavity. There can be heterogeneous thickening and indistinctness of the endometrial strip. Patients can present with tubo-ovarian abscess, which is a complex, thick-walled, multilocular cystic collection seen in the adnexal region, where there is typically they present with internal echos and multiple fluid level. So an ultrasound sometimes can help in confirming the other sequelae of PID. Now, once you have confirmed your diagnosis, or then you can go for treatment. So we have to think about chlamydia and gonococcal infections, particularly when we are planning the treatment for PID. So a single intramuscular dose of long-acting cephalosporin, and this is going to cover your gonococcal infection, plus doxycycline, 100 milligrams twice daily for 14 days to cover the chlamydia infection. So the combination results in clinical as well as microbiological cure rates of approximately 90% or more in this patient. This is from the CDC guidelines from 2015. So sometimes if you do not want to give doxycycline, the patient, we can give a single dose of azithromycin 1 gram. So most often we are giving azithromycin and sometimes doxycycline, but with doxycycline, it needs longer duration of therapy and patient may not be compliant. Then cephalosporin is for gonococcal infections. Often you can give just a single intramuscular dose of 250 milligrams of ceftriaxone, which is recommended. If the patient prefers an oral therapy, then we can give a single dose of oral cefixime, 400 milligrams. Apart from this, other cephalosporins which we can use is cefoxitin 2 gram IM with probenecid 1 gram oral, or 1 gram IM cefotaxime. So any of these regimens can be used to cover the gonococcal and chlamydia infection. Also, bearing in mind the bacterial vaginosis infection associated with it quite often, to cover the anaerobic, for the anaerobic cover, we can give metronidazole 500 milligrams twice daily for 14 days. And if there is a documented evidence of Trichomonas vaginalis infection or bacterial vaginosis infection, always add a metronidazole. So this is most often the patient's response very well to the oral regimens and outpatient therapy. Very rarely the infection may need admission and parenteral therapy. So now looking at why are we talking about pelvic inflammatory disease? Why is it important to treat? Is most important is the long-term sequelae. So tubal factor infertility is because of the salpingitis. So these pelvic infections, when they ascend up to the tube, it may cause inflammation of the epithelial surface. The epithelial surface of the tube can become inflamed, and this may lead to pelvic and peritoneal adhesions. And both of these are mostly caused by either persistent infection or previous infection. So because of these adhesions, there is alteration in the tubo-ovarian relationship. So because of the tubo-ovarian relationship will altered, it can affect the egg pickup, embryo transfer, increases the risk of ectopic pregnancy. Even if the tubal patency is maintained following this pelvic infection, there is a damage to the tube. The cilia of the tube can be damaged and increases the risk of ectopic pregnancy. The bacteria particularly which ascends along the mucosal surfaces from the cervix to the endometrium and to the fallopian tube. So this can cause acute infection, and this is again strongly associated with subsequent tubal factor infertility. So the tubal cilia can be damaged. So this is just a picture depicting So whenever there is a sexually transmitted agents along with bacterial vaginosis, they cause cervicitis, endometritis. This will cause initial tubal damage. And if the host is compromised because of the previous history of DNC, IUD insertion, or any other gynecological procedure, the infection again takes upper hand, causing salpingitis. So following salpingitis, what can be the outcome is the complete anatomy can be restored. Second is tubal deciliation. The cilia which is present in the tube can be damaged, and because of this damage to the cilia, the movement of the embryo following the zygote, the embryo and the zygote movements towards the uterine cavity can be affected. It can get entrapped and increases the incidence of ectopic pregnancy. Tubal occlusion can lead to infertility, pelvic adhesions, or pelvic abscess. So infertility can occur because of abnormal secretory movements, ciliary movements, and peristaltic function of the fallopian tube. So it's very important to understand this. And then again, bacterial vaginosis, as we discussed, we will talk about the in the prebiotics and the probiotics. So effect of the acute pelvic inflammatory disease on fertility. This is another study which looked at around 415 women who were treated for laparoscopically. They found that there was pelvic inflammatory disease, and they were reviewed after 9.5 years. Tubal occlusion was diagnosed after one infection in 12%, following 2 infections in 35%, and 3 or more infection in 75% of the women. And tubal infection was more common after non-gonococcal than gonococcal salpingitis. So non-gonococcal salpingitis is most often chlamydia infections. And then again, women with tubal factor infertility. Can you see the slides?
Now, ma'am, can you share the screen again?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Ma'am, can you please share the screen, ma'am?
Should you want me to add again?
No, ma'am.
Share the screen. Yes, ma'am.
Okay now?
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Can we continue?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is another study which looked at women with tubal factor infertility. It appears they are likely to result from past episodes of PID. They often do not give a history of PID. So it's very important that it is to note that it is a silent thing quite often. So they looked at 112 infertile women. 36 had adhesions or distal tubal occlusion on laparoscopy, which was suggestive of PID, but only 11 out of this 36, they had a documented history of pelvic inflammatory disease diagnosis. So even with timely treatment and clinical improvement in the symptoms, long-term sequelae frequently occur secondary to the scarring and adhesion formation, which accompany healing of the infection and the damaged tissues. So most often is the patients with chronic pelvic pain, infertility, and ectopic pregnancy, and they account for high morbidity, suffering, and the cost of the PID. So this study from 2003, which looked at 10,000 women who had acquired PID between 20 to 24 years of age. In these women, 18,600 women had chronic pelvic pain, 16,800 women had infertility, and 8,550 women had ectopic pregnancy. So that severe is the impact of pelvic inflammatory disease, and that much is the impact and burden to the society. This is a very good PEAT study which was done in 2008 to look at the PID evaluation and clinical health study. So they saw in women with PID the association among antibodies to chlamydia trachomatis, antibody to the heat shock protein, and the rate of pregnancy and PID recurrence. 443 women with clinical signs and symptoms of mild to moderate PID who had enrolled for the study, and then they were followed up for 84 months for the outcome to time to pregnancy and time to PID recurrence. Among these women with mild to moderate PID, antibodies to the chlamydia trachomatis was associated with reduced pregnancy rate and increased risk of recurrent PID. So even after the PID resolves, the damaged fallopian tubes, they can get blocked and they can have sterile fluid and become enlarged. So quite often, this is the thing which we see in our infertility practice. When we do an ultrasound, we see that the tubes are dilated and filled with the fluid, and there is something called as hydrosalpinx. So hydrosalpinx, sometimes the patient can present with pain, and most often the patient is asymptomatic, except for the presence with the presentation with the tubal factor infertility. So hydrosalpinx in patients who are undergoing IVF, it has a negative impact on the rate of pregnancy, the implantation rate. There is increased chances of early pregnancy loss, preterm delivery is there in these patients. So this was a study from 1999, which was in human reproduction, which looked at the hydrosalpinx and the IVF outcome. So it's a prospective randomized controlled multicenter trial in Scandinavia on whether we should be doing salpingectomy or not. So this trial was looked at 204 patients. They were subjected, some of them were subjected to laparoscopic salpingectomy, and other group was subjected to no intervention before IVF. In patients who had ultrasound visible hydrosalpinx, they had the implantation rates was 25% in the patients who underwent salpingectomy and only 12% in patients with who had no intervention. And clinical pregnancy rate was 45% versus 22% in patients who had salpingectomy and who did not have salpingectomy. And a delivery rate of 40% versus 17%. So definitely salpingectomy prior to IVF has a role in cases of hydrosalpinx. So how does this hydrosalpinx affect the IVF success rate? Is because it is believed that small amounts of fluid trickles down through the cornual opening into the endometrial cavity. And this small amounts of fluid which is leaking can have it does not have enough nutrients for the embryo development. One. Second, it can bring about some changes in the endometrium, which is now going to be not very receptive for the embryo. And also this fluid can cause mechanically, it can flush away the embryo. So these are the three ways how an hydrosalpinx impacts the success rate of our IVF. So whenever there is a hydrosalpinx, there are two options what we have. One is either delinking of the tube and other is salpingectomy. The choice depends upon the treating doctor and the patient's desire. So when we talk about delinking of the tube, either you do clipping of the tube or with a bipolar cautery, you cut the tube and disconnect it from the uterus, or you do a salpingectomy. So either of these two procedures are equally good. It just depends on what does the patient desire and what is the doctor comfortable doing it. So now we have enough evidence to say that the hydrosalpinx should be removed prior to IVF in order to improve the IVF outcome. So again, this is another study which shows that salpingectomy before IVF improves the implantation rate and reduces the likelihood of ectopic pregnancy in this patient. So now, after discussing the pelvic inflammatory disease, the impact of pelvic inflammatory disease on the fertility, particularly focusing on the hydrosalpinx and the tubal block, the next thing we will talk about the vaginal and the endometrial microbiome. So this is a new concept which is coming up. New studies, there has been studies, very recent studies, which have been looking at the HMP or the Human Microbiome Project, which is looking at the microbiome in the human body. What they say is the number of bacterial cells in the body are almost equivalent to the normal body cells. So the microbiome, particularly in relation to fertility, it is important that we talk about the vaginal microbiome and the endometrial microbiome. The vaginal microbiome is known to us since many years, and always there was a thought that the endometrium is sterile, but it is not so. The endometrium is not sterile, and the endometrium also has microbiomes. And recent studies have shown that the endometrial microbiome is different to the vaginal microbiome. So this is very important for us to understand. So normal vaginal microbiome in a healthy woman is dominated by a lactobacilli species. And whereas in about 1/5 of the women who were analyzed in this Moreno et al. This study from 2016 is a very good study which has changed the thinking about the vaginal and the endometrial microbiome. So 1/5 of the women who were analyzed, the bacterial community which was identified in the endometrium, it varied greatly from that in the vagina. So it has suggested that the endometrial and the vaginal microbiota are not identical; they are different. So what people did was they looked at the normal microbiome of the endometrium in women who underwent hysterectomy for benign conditions, and they found that there are two different groups of microbiota. So in the vaginal microbiome and its association with ART is vaginal microbiome has shown to change during the normal menstrual cycle, and it is quite dependent upon the estrogen levels. So the estrogen variations which happen in the menstrual cycle can have an impact on the vaginal microbiome. So what is the thought is in patients when they are undergoing IVF, they are going to have controlled ovarian hyperstimulation and they are going to have high estrogen levels during this stimulation phase. And this high estrogen levels can have an impact on the vaginal microbiome. And so this is yet another argument where we can talk about cryopreservation of the embryos and subsequent frozen embryo transfer in a more physiological state. But there's not much studies to confirm this, but this is a thought which is there in pipeline. So another thought is the vaginal microbiome is when they did the embryo transfer, they found that vaginal when the certain bacteria such as enterobacteria and staphylococcus, if it was found at the tip of the catheter, embryo transfer catheter, it was associated with poorer outcome. And then coming to the endometrial microbiome. So this study from 2016, this is the most recent study which analyzed the impact of endometrial microbiome on the reproductive outcome from the endometrial fluid which they took in 35 infertile women with recurrent implantation failure. So the study results shown that the endometrial microbiota profile, it can be classified as either lactobacillus dominant or non-lactobacillus dominant. And they found that the lactobacilli are present in the population of the lactobacilli is more than 90% to predict the reproductive success. So in order to have a good reproductive outcome, the lactobacilli should be more than 90% in the endometrial microbiome. So if the lactobacilli dominated is less than 90%, significantly correlates with adverse reproductive outcome, which is measured as the implantation, pregnancy, ongoing pregnancy, and miscarriage rate when compared to subjects who had lactobacillus dominant environment. So whenever there is a lactobacillus dominant environment, there is a better pregnancy rate, particularly in patients with recurrent implantation failure and recurrent miscarriage. Another concept which is coming up is about the chronic endometritis. So prevalence of chronic endometritis in the general population is estimated to be 20%, and it is in the infertile population, it is about 45%. So the high prevalence is seen to be mostly associated with recurrent implantation failure and recurrent pregnancy loss rather than other causes of infertility. So because chronic endometritis, it is often asymptomatic and it cannot be detected by an ultrasound, it is seldom suspected or even diagnosed. So there are all papers recently from 2014 and 15. So chronic endometritis is something which we are talking about. So how does this pathophysiology of vaginal imbalance affect? It has shown to have some impact even on the sperm. So increased concentrations of interleukin-1 in the vaginal environment, it triggers the reactive oxygen species, which has an effect on the membrane integrity and flexibility of the membrane. And this impairs the motility of the sperm and the sperm oocyte fusion, resulting in reduced fertilization and implantation rates. So what is the future? Looking at the future is there a role in vaginal specific probiotics? So these probiotics which are available, they contain mainly lactobacilli. They can be used over a long period of time. It can be used along with the antifungal and the antibiotics. When we see the patients with pelvic inflammatory disease, particularly suspecting a possibility of bacterial vaginosis, if we give the probiotics, it can help in restoring the vaginal flora, and particularly it reduces the high rates of recurrence. So what are these probiotics? So probiotics, they are the food or supplements which contain live microorganism intending to maintain or improve the good bacteria, the normal microflora of the body. And what are prebiotics? Prebiotics are the food which we take, which are typically high fiber food that act as a food for the human microflora. So prebiotics along with the probiotics together are the microbiome therapy. So the prebiotic foods are typically foods which are less in, which we recommend, take more of yogurt in the diet, or healthy foods like fruits, fresh fruits, vegetables, and all that can be included. What are the vaginal specific probiotics are? Lactobacillus acidophilus is the most researched strain of probiotic in establishing and maintaining a healthy vaginal balance. The other important strains which have been studied are the Lactobacillus rhamnosus and Lactobacillus reuteri. These are the other strains. So how do these probiotics help is, they help to maintain the vaginal balance by sticking to the vaginal surfaces and making it more challenging for this harmful bacteria to grow. And also lactobacillus may adhere directly to the harmful bacteria and killing them and preventing them from spreading. So these are the two ways by which the probiotics work. Now looking into a few studies, what they have to say. So this is a paper from 2019 from Human Reproduction Update, which talks about vaginal microbiome as a predictor for IVF with or without ICSI outcome. It is a prospective study. So what this study said was, looked at two questions. Is the presence or absence of certain bacteria associated with failure to become pregnant after an IVF or ICSI outcome treatment? And can the composition of this vaginal microbiome be used as an independent predictor for IVF ICSI outcome? So the results indicated that vaginal microbiome profiling using the IS-PRO technique enables stratification of the chances of becoming pregnant prior to the starting of IVF ICSI treatment. And knowledge of the vaginal microbiota may enable the couples to make a more balanced decision regarding the timing and continuation of this treatment. So these are, they are very recent studies. It's very difficult to conclude that definitely it is going to, giving probiotics is going to change the scenario of the treatment. Is very difficult to say, but there are more promising studies which are more in support of using this probiotics. Then this is another study which looked at the composition of the vaginal microbiome. Is it associated with a successful IUI in couples with unexplained infertility? So even in this study, they strengthened the potential role of lactobacillus in promoting a favorable environment for pregnancy, and it suggests that the microbiome characterization could be useful together with the standard clinical and lab assessment in the pre-IUI evaluation of the infertile couple. And another study from Human Reproduction by the Peter Maidon and his group, which talked about abnormal vaginal microbiota may be associated with poor reproductive outcome. It's a prospective study in IVF patients. So abnormal vaginal microbiota may negatively affect the clinical pregnancy rate in IVF patient, and patient could be screened and subsequently treated for abnormal vaginal microbiota prior to the fertility treatments. So then this is another relevance of using assessing the uterine microbiota in infertility. So there are nowadays we have some iGenomics companies offering tests like Emma and Alice. They are very new tests. They are quite expensive. So this study is particularly looking at those tests where they talk about Emma is particularly looking at the endometrial microbiota, where they tell you about the microbiome, and then what they do is what we need to do is take an endometrial sample where they do the DNA extraction and they look at the next generation sequencing analysis is done, and then they give you the microbiome of the uterus. And then Alice looks at the chronic endometritis and recommends the antibiotic therapy which could be used. But these tests are fairly new and they are expensive. So how much can we apply in our clinical practice? We will know only with time. So so evidence that endometrial microbiota has an effect on the implantation success or failure. So these results demonstrate that existence of an endometrial microbiota that is highly stable during the acquisition of endometrial receptivity. However, pathological modifications can be there, which is associated with poor reproductive outcome for IVF, and this finding adds a novel microbiological dimension to the reproductive process. So these are all very new studies, very new tests which are available to us. And this is another study from European Journal of Obs-Gynae and Reproductive Biology, which says that treatment of bacterial vaginosis improves the ART success rate. So they saw that in bacterial vaginosis untreated patient, it was 24%. And if the patients were treated with bacterial vaginosis treatment with the probiotics, the success rate was 49%. So just to conclude my talk with some few take-home messages in which, so the impact of chlamydia and gonococcal infection on the fallopian tube currently makes these pathogens the most important known preventable cause of infertility. So in a lot of Western countries, what they do is they do the screening programs of these pathogens. So when the patient comes with a pap smear, quite often they take a endocervical swab to look for chlamydia and gonococcal infection and they treat it. So this has a critical impact in the prevention of the tubal pathology and infertility. And tubal fracture infertility ranks one of the most common cause of infertility, about 30% of the cases of female infertility, and most often it is a result of pelvic inflammatory diseases. And presence of bacterial vaginosis increases the risk of STIs and helps in ascending of the infection. So probably give, along with your antibiotic treatments, what we discussed for treatment of sexually transmitted infection, if we combine with the probiotic, it may help in reducing the spread. And very new studies which are coming up, which are saying, which are, we had in the past thinking that probably the uterine cavity is sterile. That is not anymore. And there is the vaginal and the uterine microbiome. They are different. We still have to understand more what is the uterine microbiome environment to apply into our clinical practice. And there is emerging evidence of the role of uterine microbiome and chronic endometritis in cases of infertility, particularly in cases of recurrent implantation failure and recurrent miscarriage. And probably probiotics may have a role in improving your IVF and ICSI cycles success rate. But however, we need more studies to adapt this into our routine practice. Thank you.
Ma'am, this is Dr. Kiran.
Yes,
thank you so much for a wonderful, very lucid talk, ma'am. I think as usual, you go into a lot of depth into covering these very important topics. So there are already some questions in the chat, ma'am. I'll read the questions to you and you can answer them, ma'am, if it's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Ma'am, the first question is from Dr. Nirja Valli, ma'am. She asks about this NAT test is for which sample in both partners?
See, either you can take the endocervical swabs for the test, and from the that is from the female, and from the male you take from the penis, the swabs from the penis, and that can be subjected to the NAT test.
Right, ma'am. The second question is from Dr. Pramila Malik. She asks about what is the role of semen culture, and the second part of the question is do both the partners need to be treated, and the third part of the question is what is the role of infection in PTL and PPROM?
Yeah, see, with the semen culture, definitely. See, I mean, when quite often when we see a lot of, but not every patients with infertility, every male patient when the couple comes with infertility, we do not subject everyone to semen culture. Only when there is there is leukocytosis in the semen sample, we send it for semen culture, and that is for the and according to the culture, we can treat the patient. And yes, I believe in treating both the partners, because these sexually transmitted infections are usually shared between the partners. So if you treat the female partner, it's and if the husband is also infected, which is highly likely, then she can get reinfected. So it's always a good idea to treat with both the partners with whatever the therapy, like the doxy or the azithromycin, whatever you're using for chlamydia infection. And I mean, the third question regarding obstetrics, I really cannot comment so much on it. That role of infection, there is definitely a role in preterm delivery and premature PROM. There is definitely a role of infection, what we have, probably.
Ma'am, the next question is from Dr. Aparna. She asks how to treat distressing excess cervical discharge where antibiotics and antimicrobials are of no use.
Yeah, see, ideally, if you take a cervical, when you are treating a patient, sometimes you might just, in our Indian setting, we may not be able to do the cervical swabs and NAT test and all for every patient. So when you are suspecting PID, you are going to give them a routine treatment, what we will give with either ceftriaxone dose or a cefexime oral, plus you are going to give the doxy or erythromycin. So even if the patient is not responding, then in that case, you will have to take a cervical swab for the NAT test, look for gonococcal or or the chlamydia infection, and then you can do the culture sensitivity. Probably what you're giving, the patient is not responding to it. It maybe the patient is resistant to it. And other thing is, quite often the cervical discharge can be there because of cervical erosions. So you have to look at that part also and look for cervical erosions and treat that as well. So sometimes patient may not be having infection and the cervical erosion may be a reason for the excessive vaginal discharge. So we have to look into that as well.
And the next question is again from Dr. Aparna. What is the criteria for managing hydrosalpinx conservatively?
Criteria is like, see, when a patient is not symptomatic, not every woman who has a hydrosalpinx, you want to do a surgery and remove the hydrosalpinx. Okay. So a patient who is desiring fertility and who is planning to undergo IVF treatment, that is a patient you would want to remove the hydrosalpinx. Otherwise, you will not want to remove hydrosalpinx for every woman you find it. If you do, if the patient comes to you for some reason and you do a pelvic ultrasound and you find a hydrosalpinx, you're not going to treat it if she's not desiring fertility.
Right. And the next question is again from Dr. Aparna. How to treat chronic endometritis?
Chronic endometritis, again, the similar protocol, we normally try to give them the doxy, and that is the simple protocol what we end up using in chronic endometritis, because other ways to take an endometrial biopsy and look for particularly those infection. And as I discussed, not many diagnostic centers offer this test. The one which is from iGenomics, the ALICE test, is the one which is looking at chronic endometritis, in which you take an endometrial sample, and what they do is they extract the DNA from the microorganism, and they do the next generation sequencing and give you the microorganism, the bacteria which is causing the infection, and then they recommend to you the exact antibiotic which is needed for this particular bacterial infection. So if we are very specific to find out what is the organism for chronic endometritis and the exact treatment, ALICE test is something which you can look at, but again, then you have to think about the cost of the test also.
Right. And the next question is from Dr. Neerja Valli. She's asking if we need to start probiotics for all patients planning IVF.
See, as I presented in my talk, there is emerging evidence from very recent studies that probiotics are good. It settles your vaginal flora, the endometrial flora, is all becoming more normal. So probably it's going to make the chances of implantation and all better. But personally, I am giving in all my patients who are planning for IVF, we give them in the 1 or 2 months before the probiotics. So maybe it helps, but see, probiotics, they are not going to be harmful, and they're not very expensive. They're not going to be harmful and not expensive. So it's worth a try. But definitely, I think it definitely has a role in patients with recurrent implantation failure, in recurrent miscarriage, from whatever is the recent evidence what is coming. But there is no 100% evidence to say that, yes, you should put all your patients on probiotics before IVF, but it's just a practice. In IVF, nothing is black and white. So much is gray.
Right.
So with probiotics, what I would say is it's worth a try.
Right. And the next question is from Dr. Dev Kumar. So he asks you that how would you prescribe these prebiotics, probiotics in normal clinical practice based on the current evidence? What he wants to know is what are the type, the dosing regimen.
Most of these probiotics which are available, they have this lactobacillus, acidophilus, or that rhamnosus and the reuteri. That is a combination which is most often available in the market. And what I do is I give them pre-IVF for 1 or 2 months as an empirical thing, basically, because we don't have now 100% evidence. So we can give 1 or 2 months before the IVF on these probiotics, and the combination, as I said.
Right. And the next question is from Dr. Nirja Valli. She asks, if you see minimal spill in tubal test, can we go ahead with the IUI?
See, either your tubes are patent or your tubes are blocked. So if you can see spill when you do your tubal patency test, then you can go ahead with your IUI.
Okay. And the next question is
like a partial block and all, with
right.
Either it's a complete block or completely open tube.
Right. The next question is from Dr. Kumkum Saini. What she asks is, what is the role of syndromic approach in treatment of PID, and what is the utility of commercially available multi-drug kits?
See, this commercially available multi-drug kits, personally, I don't use those much. I don't like that much. Normally, with my patients, I try to give them separately. What we give, like either cefixime 400 mg combined with either azithromycin 1 gram as a single dose, along with the fluconazole tablet 150 mg. And same thing, we give it to the partner as well. So this is what I follow. I don't like, because they give secnidazole is there. I prefer more of metrogyl compared to secnidazole. So if I had to add something to cover anaerobic infection, then I would go for 7 to 10 days of metronidazole rather than a single dose of secnidazole.
And the next question is from Dr. Jayachandran S. So he asks, what is the probiotic brand available for bacterial vaginosis and the dosage and duration?
The probiotic brands, I think Shield has one, which is Totalis, and number of there are few other companies which have, like Ecoflora is from Tablet India. So these are the few brands which are available. And 1 tablet daily for 1 to 2 months is what I normally use.
And the next question is from Dr. Muthu Kumari. She asks, in case of persistent vulval itching, not responding to treatment, what do we do?
Yeah, so we give some empirical treatment, and then after that, you do your vaginal swabs or endocervical swabs to look for the particular specific bacteria which is a cause for infection, and treat it accordingly.
Ma'am, there's a request from Dr. Patlola Reddy. He says, I missed the initial part of this webinar due to an emergency. Can you please share the PPT and link of recording to his email ID?
Yeah, so probably you're recording, Kiran, so we can.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. There's a compliment from Dr. Milind who says, excellent talk, Dr. Sweta.
Thank you, Dr. Milind.
Again, one more compliment from Dr. Reddy, ma'am. Wonderful and very lucid talk.
Thank you so much.
Okay, ma'am. The next question, ma'am, from Dr. Promila Malik. In India, if genital tuberculosis can also be suspected in early stage before permanent damage to tubes and endometrium, if a patient of PID not responding to normal PID treatment, what do we do?
Yeah, of course, definitely. In India, we have to always think about genital tuberculosis. We should have a very high suspicion of genital tuberculosis, and but patients with genital tuberculosis will always it is more of a silent infection. It's always genital tuberculosis is secondary tuberculosis, secondary to pulmonary tuberculosis. So that is one thing, and it is also like a silent thing. So always we have to ask the patient about the past history of tuberculosis, and when you are suspecting tuberculosis in any patient, you have to, it's always a site specific biopsy. So you have to take an endometrial biopsy and check for three things. One, I always whenever we do an endometrial biopsy suspecting genital tuberculosis, we send it for histopathology and CB-NAT test by gene expert and AFB culture. So these are the three things you will send it for testing, and if it comes positive, then you will have to treat the patients with anti-tuberculous therapy. So anti-tuberculous therapy in genital tuberculosis is for 6 months, where we give 4 drugs for 2 months and 2 drugs for 4 months. And I always recommend that you do, we have to counsel the patient and encourage them to complete the treatment, because dropout and non-compliance is very high. And definitely genital tuberculosis causes significant damage to the tube, and that has to be definitely kept in mind whenever we think about tubal factor infertility.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is from Dr. Geeta. She asks, should we treat cervical erosion in infertility cases, and what would be your preferred antibiotics for the same?
See, if there is a cervical erosion, it could be just normal, unless the patient has excessive vaginal discharge, which is uncomfortable for her. Only in those cases, I would treat a cervical erosion, not all.
There's a compliment from Dr. Lalita Kotari, ma'am. Excellent talk, Dr. Sweta.
Thank you, Dr. Lalita.
Yes, ma'am. So many questions coming up, ma'am. So hope you're not exhausted, ma'am.
Whatever you're comfortable, we'll take it.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much again, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is from Dr. Aparna. What she asks is, shall the male counterpart also should be treated with probiotic? If yes, how long?
With the male, there are like people talking about sperm microbiome and all, but really we don't know if the male partner should be treated or not. Maybe in the next few years we'll have more evidence, more papers in relation to the male counterpart also, if they need to be treated. As of now, there's not much evidence to say, but yes, there are lots of studies going on looking at the sperm microbiome as well.
Ma'am, there's one compliment from Dr. Pariniti Srivastava. She says it was a very knowledgeable talk.
Thank you.
So there are a lot of requests for sharing the link, and Dr. Vavaldas.
You can put on YouTube and share the link with.
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. There's one question from Dr. Nagashri. Patient with bilateral tube masses, can we start ATT?
I mean, that's a very difficult. That's very difficult because to know whether it is because of tuberculosis or any other pelvic infection. So just by looking at a bilateral tuber-ovarian mass, you cannot just start anybody on ATT. If you want to start on ATT, either there should be a documented evidence of tuberculosis. So you may put in a scope, you can do a laparoscopy and see, you can remove the TO mass, subject it to histopathology, and if there is tuberculosis, you can see tubercles around the tube, around in the pelvis, and also if there is a clinical evidence of tuberculosis, then you can start ATT, but all TO masses cannot be because of tuberculosis. So you have to confirm that it is TB before you start anybody on ATT.
Ma'am, there's one compliment from Dr. Priya Kanappan. She says, ma'am, excellent talk. Ma'am, there's one comment from Dr. Jayachandran. He tells he wants to add a point that in recurrent pruritus vulva, we have to rule out diabetes.
Yeah, that's definitely, it's always good idea to rule out diabetics, any kind of recurrent vaginal infections, recurrent pruritus vulva. Yeah, definitely we have to rule out diabetes.
Ma'am, the next question is from Dr. Indira Devi. She says, is it mandatory to keep these pre-probiotic in the refrigerator?
I don't think so. Do you recommend Totalis to be put it in the fridge?
No, no, no.
No, yeah, it can be kept outside. Yeah,
Yes.
that's what we do. It's just like it's just normally it stays on your shelf in your pharmacy.
Alright. There's one comment from Dr. Lalita. She says, excellent talk, ma'am. It's very good information. Ma'am, I think the last question is there any temperature to maintain the potency, ma'am?
Yeah, that's again the same question. I think that it doesn't need to be refrigerated. It can just on the shelf, normal room temperature.
Right. Ma'am, the next question is from Dr. Nagashri. Postmenopausal patient with pruritus, vulva. What is it?
Beyond the scope of this present, quite often postmenopausal pruritus can be again you have to rule out diabetes. It could be because of recurrent infection. There are lots of reasons for pruritus vulva. It can be because of postmenopausal women low estrogen, thinning of the vulva. That could be itself a reason for pruritus. So sometimes these patients may just need local estrogen application. So that could either infection or because of the age factor reducing estrogen levels.
Ma'am, PID infertility, Mantox test positive. How to proceed?
See, all Mantox tests cannot. With Mantox test, if it is negative, it rules out tuberculosis. That is good. But if it is positive, it's not. It's an indirect test for tuberculosis. So Mantox positive does not mean that the patient definitely has tuberculosis, and it has to be treated. I just discussed earlier where I said that when you want to suspect tuberculosis of the genital tract, you have to take a site-specific biopsy. Endometrial biopsy is the only way to confirm that the only way to confirm that the patient has genital tuberculosis, and that is the one who would need. On the basis of just a Mantox test positive, you would not subject the patient to anti-tuberculous therapy.
Ma'am, there's one comment from Dr. Priya Kannappan that natural food probiotics should be in the fridge.
We talk about the yogurts, fruits, vegetables, good healthy diet, avoiding low sugars. They are all the prebiotics.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, there's one more question from Dr. Indira Devi. Is it safe to use during pregnancy?
I think it is safe. What do you say about Totalis?
It is.
Yes. Kumar sir?
It is.
It is safe to be used in pregnancy. Yeah.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, Dr. Priya Kannappan missed the initial part, so she wanted the recordings. Definitely, ma'am. Your thoughts on postmenopausal atrophic pruritus, ma'am?
And we just discussed it before, isn't it? Atrophic pruritus, again, you need a local vaginal application of estrogen.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is from Dr. Pranita Srivastava. She tells ATT has 6 months course. If the patient is conceived in the 4th month of taking it, is it safe to take for the remaining 2 months?
Yeah, we can continue. INH and rifampicin is the one which you are going to give in the last 2 months of the 6-month course, and INH rifampicin are safe to be taken during pregnancy. So we normally recommend that the patient should continue her ATT of 6 months, even if she conceives. It's
Yes, ma'am. There's one comment from Dr. Promila. She says PID is the most important but most ignored part in cases of infertile young couples. Postponing pregnancy should be encouraged to use barrier contraception to prevent PID and infertility and ectopic pregnancy later.
Yeah, that's what we talked in the, because see the scenario in the country is changing. Women, there are more and more working women. Women are delaying pregnancy. The society is changing. People are where there are multiple sexual partners. So because of all of these reasons, definitely there is going to be an increasing incidence of PID in our country. And if they have good sexual hygiene with barrier contraception, they can even avoid unnecessary pregnancies and unnecessary MTPs also, which can be again a reason for tubal damage. So definitely barrier contraception is a very good idea.
Any more questions, doctors, to ma'am? Any comments on the topic? Okay. So thank you so much, ma'am, for taking time out from your schedule and giving us this. I think the presentation was excellent, but the interaction and your answering was even more brilliant, as usual. I have heard ma'am a lot, so I think we all had an opportunity to hear ma'am.
And I would thank to all the people who have logged in and participated in the discussions as well. And thank you very much to Shield and particularly you, Kiran, for being a part of this and helping us organize all this talk and getting me connected to so many people. So, and in this time of COVID, when we are at home, not doing much, being connected with this webinar is like a stimulus, for us to read and teach.
I also take this opportunity, ma'am, to thank you and the esteemed audience and Dr. Kiran to make this happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.